I just started the recording. So thank you again. After recording, I want this to be recorded as well. Yeah, Nikhil and I worked together in 2020, 2021 at eHealth. Very crazy times. It was just beginning of COVID. I remember we worked in the office for just 1 or 2 months together and then work from home days. We were both connections of our ex-VP, Pramod Kincha, who had one of the tech talks last year in IT Society. I believe, Nikhil, you know Pramod from your LinkedIn experience, right?
Right.
Yeah. Our life at eHealth was very similar with Nikhil. Nikhil was a senior principal engineer helping products platform teams mostly, and I was a principal helping more infrastructure teams at eHealth. I remember my first few interactions with this very experienced, well-equipped engineer. I was so impressed with him that it was a bit hesitant for me to interact, actually, but I saw Nikhil as one of the most modest people I have ever seen in the industry with such broad knowledge. I learned too many things, both technically and culturally from Nikhil. Thank you, Nikhil. At a glance, Nikhil's career started back in his home country, India, at Simon Tech. If I'm wrong, let me know, because this is just from your LinkedIn profile and our mutual talks in the past. He moved to the US, specifically the Bay Area, at the end of 2010. And 2 years later, he moved to LinkedIn. He joined LinkedIn, and he was a senior engineering manager at LinkedIn. After LinkedIn, he joined eHealth, and he switched back to IC track. So Nikhil's career is very similar to mine. We just switch lanes occasionally. So currently, Nikhil is a senior principal engineer in eHealth. He had many interactions with many leaders in his career. As you may notice, he has been a senior principal for the last 4 years of his career, where there's no higher role, and he could be promoted to, actually. This means he's always working with VPs, C-suite leaders. I knew he was working on improving his leadership skills, his vocabulary in time, and he was talking to me about this vocabulary that he's assembling. I asked him to join and have a presentation for us. He's so kind that he can say no to me. Thanks, Nikhil, for being with us, and I'm looking forward to scheduling another time with you as well for another topic. The session will be interactive. Audience, you can interrupt and share your thoughts. But for questions, we will accept questions at the end of the session. Nikhil, I will pass it to you.
Cool. Thanks, Ardam, for the nice introduction. And so I'll.
Nikhil, your sound is a bit lower than usual. Maybe a setting on.
Just give me one moment.
Sure.
So I think it has something to do with the audio setting. So I'm just going to try something different here.
It might be on my end as well. Let me reshare.
How about this? I tried changing the setting. Is this any different or better?
It is not very different, but that is fine.
How about now?
Oh, this is better. This is better.
This is better, right? I think, yeah, now I'm not too loud, right? I'm not shouting.
It is good. It is good.
Okay. I think it was the input volume that somehow got changed. So, yeah.
So presentation is there, right? You are able to see?
Yeah. I want to see the presentation. Yeah. Awesome. So, friends, it's my pleasure to, come and chat about a topic that I would say has been a learning for me. And this slide was supposed to be a bit of an introduction, but Arnam has given a better introduction than I could have introduced myself. So I would just add couple things to it, like in my 22 years plus career, right, I have played different roles, as Arnam mentioned. I have been an individual contributor writing code all the time. I have been a tech lead, I have been an architect, I have been a first level manager, I have been a senior manager. And in all these different roles, I have gotten different skills to learn. And then skills acquired in one path also play a very important role in other paths, because as you grow in your career, right, you influence a wider set of people, and that's where all the soft skills that we learn, right, they come very handy. And I and Arnab worked for almost 2 years, very closely with each other, right? And though he has presented it in a very kind and friendly manner, that that learning is mutual, because as you grow and you work with other talented people, right? We all learn from each other, and that's the extremely important aspect, because no one person knows everything, right? So we always learn new skills, we always learn new techniques, technologies from each other, right? And I think that's what this society is for. I think that's one of the reasons this IT society has been founded, so that people come together as a community, they help each other enrich their careers, and I'm glad to be part of this circle. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is what I want to talk about today. And again, this is a very, very informal discussion or chat. So, as Ardam said, feel free to, ask me to pause if something on the slides is not clear to you. Or if you want to discuss something, right? If you want to share, any of the audience wants to share something important, right? It's highly encouraged, because we want this to be an interactive discussion. It's not like I passing on some wisdom. It's like the collective wisdom of everybody here, right? That makes us better. If you have any specific questions, you can also type in the chat, and then we'll keep an eye on the chat, and we'll try to take them as and when required. So mainly we'll talk about what is technical terminology, like what do we mean by that, what all comes under that umbrella, and why does it matter? Is it really important? Why is it important? Then I'll talk about some of the commonly misunderstood concepts or terms that cause confusion, right? And they might cause disconnect between people. It might cause certain hurdles to projects. So we'll talk about that. Then I'll provide some tips about how to master technical terminology, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. So next slide, please. So what is technical terminology? So every language has certain vocabulary, right? Now, when we work in a particular domain, field, or industry, right, or even a subset of that, uh, that has a specialized language where certain phrases are defined, certain abbreviations are used, right? Certain terms are coined, certain terms are born, and that becomes a common knowledge to people who work in that particular field or domain. So pretty much everybody either knows it or is supposed to know that, and that is meant to make our communication much better and efficient. So that's what is technical terminology for us, and it could be used in any discussion like what we are discussing right now in a team meeting environment, right? Or it could be over emails, wiki, or any RFCs, documents that we write, right? It could be part of any business proposals, presentations. So it's everywhere. It could be the phrases, it could be sometimes some idioms, some jargon, acronyms. So all of that is technical terminology. Now I have tried to categorize the technical terminology in few buckets. Now, this is my attempt. Uh, I don't mean to say that this is the exhaustive list of all the categories, right? There could be many more, right? And then you will also find that some of them could be a bit overlapping. So let's walk through those categories and see whether that makes sense to us. So on the next slide, we will have the first category. So I think I've come up with about 7 categories. So the first one, I have sort of clubbed it together. It's about the architecture and design patterns. Now, typically, I'm sure most of us have had this question in our minds at some point, that what is the difference between architecture and design, right? Or where does the boundary of design end and where does architecture begin? And one of the books actually provided a pretty neat analogy. It says that you can think of architecture as town planning. So this term becomes a bit confusing because when we live in a house, the house is designed by an architect, right? So that's why when we think of architecture in software, right, it might look like, okay, I'm designing a module, right? I'm designing a service, I'm designing a component. So then what is architecture versus what is design? And often this might become bit of a confusion or a source of tension among team members, that if there is an architect in the team, right, sometimes other people might think that if we have an architect, does that mean the architect is going to make all the decisions, right? Then what am I supposed to do, right? I mean, I'm a creative software engineer, so I want to design my own stuff. So what's the boundary between these two? So I always think of this based on the inspiration I drew from this book, that think of architecture as like town planning, whereas individual facilities, so there might be a hospital, there might be a school, there might be a garden, there might be a park, there might be a row of houses, right? So all of them get designed by their own creators, but then there has to be someone who makes sure that at a high level, whatever we are building, like a town, is cohesive, the right things go at the right places, right? And that system can scale well, and we are able to reason about it. So this is where I think the role of architect comes into picture. And then when we look at the architectural patterns versus design patterns, you will also see that distinction get reflected there. So when we think of architectural patterns, we'll see things like the microservice patterns or the monolithic patterns, client server architecture or event driven architecture. Whereas when we think of design patterns, right, they're a little more specific to subsystems or modules or components that we are building. The most famous ones that pretty much all of us know are the Gang of Four patterns, like singletons and factory, builder, decorator, observer, right, and state machine and visitor and whatever. So this is in my opinion the first category that we can focus on to enrich our technical terminology. The next category I would come to is the design principles. Now there is a difference between the patterns and the principles. When we say patterns, it's pretty much a solution or a template to common problems. So I mean, there are lots of problems that we all solve every day, but many of those problems fall into specific categories. They are like each other. So we look at what is common to those problems, and then the way we can solve those problems in a common way becomes a pattern. So whenever you spot a problem, you see that, oh, this problem is of this type, right? And then maybe I can apply this architectural pattern, right? So for example, something is happening, someone else wants to stay tuned. So that could be an event pattern, right? Where the producer produces an event, anybody who's interested listens to that event and handles that event in whichever way they're interested in. So this is the pattern. Whereas design principles are more like guidelines. So they provide us some best practices, tips about how to design our code. They don't provide necessarily some patterns, but they are more about guidelines about how to write code, how to design our code so that it's more readable, more maintainable, more resilient, more scalable. And different principles are meant for that. So some of the examples that come to my mind are very famous Solid. Hey, Adam, I saw your hand raised. So
Oh, I just wanted to confirm my thought process there. Like it is, patterns are kind of, to me, realization of these principles, kind of like to facilitate, like for someone who is asking like, hey, okay, I understood open close principle, but I don't know how to implement that. So they create a pattern for that. Like if you do this way, if you organize this way, your structure, then this will be realizing open close principle and also single responsibility as well, kind of. Principles are more kind of like philosophical thing behind patterns from my understanding.
That's a very nice sort of way to look at the relation between these two, in my opinion. Absolutely right. Uh, Now, I have just listed few principles on this page, and there are many more. But everything on this slide, right? Sort of a disclaimer. I'm not going to read every line. I don't expect you to read every line on these slides right now. They are just examples. So just have a glance, and that's all. We'll share the slides after the chat, and then you can refer to them. But for example, Solid is a sort of very core set of core principles that appears frequently in pretty much any design that we do, right? For example, the single responsibility or open close. So you want your classes or package to be close to modification but open to extension, right? So that you make your code more maintainable. uh, there are a lot of object-oriented design principles. Then some of the more philosophical, as Adam said, right? For example, Yagni, right? It's a very philosophical principle in my opinion. So it's not about how to design a particular class. So it says that you are not going to need it. So basically, whenever we build a system, right, we want to keep it iterative, look at the requirements, and design to that, and not to sort of do too much of speculation and over engineer when we don't know the requirements fully. So that's what this principle tries to tell us. So this is kind of the second category over there. The third category is, I would call it protocols. So as we know, right, when two systems, two parties interact with each other, right, that communication has to have certain structure, and the protocols give that structure. So all the protocols that are listed here, and there are tons of them, but HTTPS, like anything that happens over web has to follow the HTTP protocol. And then we have underlying TCP/IP, then we have OAuth built on top of HTTP, we have TLS, LDAP, DNS, and so on and so forth. So these protocols have like their own special place in the terminology world. Next slide, please. The fifth category I have gotten is, the fourth one is tools and technologies, and you're going to see some overlap between this and the fifth slide. So again, what I've listed here are again sub buckets, and then inside each you will find tons of things there. Like we have DevOps tools, we have public cloud, we have UI technologies, server side technologies. You can slice things horizontally, vertically, diagonally, whichever way you want, right? And then every dimension you are going to find a lot of jargon over there. Now connected to the tools and technologies, you will find the processes, because often when we have on the next slide, if we take a look at the slide, we talked about DevOps on the previous slide. Here we talk about the development methodologies, right? So there is certain connection here. So when it comes to process and practices, we talk about waterfall, we talk about agile, Scrum, Safe, Kanban. And it's very important to note these terms, and not just note these terms, but also thoroughly understand what they mean. For example, a very famous example, we'll come to this later in sort of a dedicated slide, but there is a lot of confusion between what is agile, what is Scrum, right? Are they the same, etc. So it's important to know the concepts and know the terms used for that. So this is about the processes. On the next slide, the next category is the industry domains. So actually, this is a realization that sort of happened to me after I joined my current job at eHealth. So my first job was in a very different environment, in a storage domain, where we worked on storage systems and application orchestration. And there the technical jargon was really, really super technical, because when you talk about the storage systems or you talk about some security stuff, right? So when I worked at Veritas or Symantec, I wasn't too much exposed to the business side of things. It was way more technical. So all the jargon or the terminology reflected that. When I joined eHealth, I realized that it comes from the insurance domain, right? Because eHealth is an insurance marketplace / domain, and it's at the intersection of some of it has traits coming from some of these domains listed here. For example, it shows some traits of e-commerce, some from insurtech, right? And
even,
then
even marketplace or e-commerce, like it had lots of jargon. Actually, I remember we had pages of abbreviations
right.
they were giving in onboarding,
right. And on this particular page, right, I can really talk about highlight about one particular aspect of, or one particular advantage of knowing the terminology right, is that once you know that you are working in a particular domain that has a set of problems, right, then in that case it starts becoming easier for you to tap into the right patterns, right principles, right solutions to simplify. Like we don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. If some problem has been solved, we want to know about that and reuse that solution, right? We want to use wisdom of others, right? And then grow. But if you don't know the overall classification of the problem, right, it becomes very hard for us to find out help. So, for example, uh, we use terms like sorting and searching, right? So they are making specific problems more generic, right? So underlying generic concept. For example, in case of e-commerce, right, there are some things like shopping cart or payment gateways or like inventory management. Now, every problem that you are trying to solve may not 100% match with the known patterns. But if you are able to identify the resemblance, then it becomes easier to figure out which part of the pattern that already exists. You can just apply that. Which part you have to think fresh, right? Sometimes it happens that there are two or three different patterns that you can blend and come up with a solution for your problem. So that's where I think understanding which domain you work, understanding in depth the terminology of that domain, and then knowing how those problems are solved in the industry becomes very important. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the last one, and this is the least technical part of that terminology classification. But I have seen this one little harder to master because as a person who doesn't have English as the first language, right? Uh, uh, I mean, some of these idioms, some of the phrases, right? Uh, I learned them first in some technical conversation without really having the background of what they in general mean, right? And then you have to try and understand what they mean. Sometimes certain idioms are only applicable in certain cultures or contexts, right? They may not be applicable in other cultures, right? So when you walk into a meeting room and you hear about, oh, what do we need to do to keep the lights on, right? It may not click at the first moment exactly what people are talking about, right? And then you realize that, okay, keeping lights on means doing those business specific routine functions that you have to keep doing so that you serve your customers. I mean, that's where we are not talking about adding new features. That's where we are not talking about the architectural changes, but we are just talking about run the business as usual, right? Whatever you need to do that to support that or move the needle, right? So uh, I mean, we all use different meters and gauges, and then the needle moves, right? So when the needle moves, you know that there is some noticeable change happening. Something is happening which you can notice, you can measure, right? But when your leader comes and says that, hey guys, whatever planning you are doing for the next year, we want to see the needle move in a particular area, right? It's good to know exactly what they're talking about, and sometimes good to go to the roots and find out exactly why these terms came into existence, and then we really understand the meaning behind them. Okay, Arnab, I will just pause and see that now that we have covered these categories, right? Do you have any thoughts to add, or maybe any experiences to share? Uh, yeah.
I I have one ridiculous experience actually. I might have told you before. Um, in eHealth, I was invited to a meeting that not really I was required. I was kind of optional in the invite. So I just wanted to join and get some domain context actually. And I joined. I remember our VP, Brian, just sent me a private chat message like, you don't have to spend your time with this meeting. It's not very relevant to you. If you want, you can just drop. You don't have to attend. And no, it was not another message. He just told at the beginning of the meeting, everyone is there. And I just told him and all the audience from my network knowledge. I told like, hey, no, it's not a problem. I just want to get some knowledge about the domain. I will be here in promiscuous mode because in networking there is a concept that you listen to traffic in promiscuous mode. Actually, you don't interfere. But in English, it is a very, very, how would I say, that a word that you cannot use in workplace, even in your daily life. Probably you don't need to use that word. Everyone just like there has been a silence for a few seconds, and then people understood what I meant, and people know how normally I behave. So people didn't question that much. But Ryan, just like from back channel, he told me like, what did you mean by using that word? I said like, network cards, promiscuous mode listening, it's not a problem. And he said like the real meaning of this word and daily life is very unethic, or I mean, you cannot use this word in workplace. I was very ashamed actually. So I mean, even the language that we learn from technical things, we should validate that their English meaning actually, the concepts that we use, or sometimes back to the drawing board might mean something very trivial to us, but that's not our leader is asking from us. It's something else. Context is also important. Sometimes in some context, keep the lights on might be something good, but some context for some teams, it means like you are not moving forward and not doing progressive projects. You're just like keeping the lights on. So we need to know the context. We need to know how these phrases are used in which context. This is I believe very important.
Very well said, Adam. And uh, a big coincidence, uh, maybe that's because, as they say, right, great minds think alike. I had gotten into exactly same situation with exactly the same word, because I heard that term, in the context of building a network sniffer. So, when you are building a network sniffer, right, you need to listen to all the packets that are flowing on the LAN, not just the ones destined to you, right? So I concluded that the promiscuous mode means you read everything, right? And I use semi-jokingly, I use this word to indicate that I read a lot of books, right? And then a kind friend, pulled me on the side and said, "Dude, that's not what you mean, right?" And lesson learned. Just because a word sounds fancy, I shouldn't be, putting my foot in my mouth. And another silly example was, I was back in India, right? This was 20 years ago, and we were discussing whether we should use the technology called. So this was way before the Ajax took over, right? So getting some interactivity on the web pages used to be difficult, and we had some tools like people used applets long back, the Java applets, or there was this technology by a company called Macromedia, which I believe is acquired by Adobe, if I'm not wrong. But they had this technology called Flash, and then they had next version called Flex. So we were using Macromedia Flash a lot to build some interactivity into our user interfaces. And I use that word as a verb in some discussion without knowing that in United States it has a very different meaning, and you don't want to use that in a uh, technical or business discussion. So once again, and unfortunately on that occasion there was no kind friend, so there was no gentle reminder that there was a lot of ridicule that it came with. So I think it's important to really know what we are talking about, what words we hear, what terms we use, what's the context, right? And then go to the root of that. Cool. So I think with that we can go to the next one. So now we talked about the categories, right? Now, next two slides are just purely example. And again, we're not going to go into any of these details, but we just use DevOps as one bullet point on one of the previous slides. I think it was in the tools bucket, right? But when we talk about DevOps, there are all these things that come to your mind. Or if you go to the next slide, right? Because the purpose is not that, we discuss all of these terms. I think, yeah, most of us know or have heard these terms, but when we talk about the high availability or disaster recovery, right? These are some of the terms that come up. And one important learning I had at some point in my career was, uh, as a software engineer, when I looked at high availability or disaster recovery, I would only focus on solving the problem. For example, I wanted to make sure that my systems are available, or if a disaster happens, they run somewhere else. But when I talk to product managers, or when I talk to senior directors, VPs, right? they're not only interested in how your problem is being solved, or they might be less interested in how you are solving the problem, but they're more interested in business visible metrics. For example, if you are building a high availability solution, right? What is, so those two blue terms that are highlighted here, right? So what is the mean time to repair or recover, right? Or what is the mean time in between the failures? So those are extremely important. That's where those, 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines come into picture. Or when it comes to disaster recovery, what is the recovery point objective? Like, if a disaster happens, right? How much of data you have already lost by that time, so that you just can't fix that. Or to bring the system back alive, right? How much time you need, right? So that's the recovery time objective. So sometimes I would go into a meeting with a lot of good ideas and understanding about how we will solve the problem, but not really compute the answer to what is the RPO and what is the RTO. Sometimes I won't even know what is the RPO, what is the RTO, right? That becomes very important, that when you're trying to solve a problem, right? uh, if you're solving a problem in HRDR space, it's important to understand what are the key terms that any person would use in the context of that problem, and then do your homework, master those terms, and then come up with the answers, so that you are able to work with people of different levels here. Yeah.
Probably we are doing these already. We know these. We plan things based on these, like for example, MTTR,
Yeah.
mean time to recovery. Like we just like measure that, and we just explain. Oh, after a failure, it took like this amount of time in average to recover the system. And instead of saying these 8 words, just
Yeah.
our MTTR is this, MTTR is this, kind of just
Yeah.
very summary. So we need to know the concepts to better communicate with, especially with leaders. Actually, this is also my struggle. Like sometimes they put some abbreviation while we are talking about something, and I don't know that, and I don't know even if not knowing that is a shame for my level of leadership, or it is fine. It's just like a regular abbreviation that you may not know. So it is better to be exposed these concepts in your domain, right? Like, what is the best way, Nikhil, to get familiar with these abbreviations and or the concepts? Where can we learn this?
Yeah. So I think we can go to the next slide, and that will be sort of a connection to that. Next couple of slides we'll talk about that. So this is sort of a repetition of I and Ardam already talked about this, but why does the terminology matter, right? So the first big reason is it brings conciseness in communication, and I'm just going to take a completely non-technical example. So a while ago, I visited Ardam for a nice Turkish breakfast, and he served me with really great Turkish tea. So I'm going to take example of tea. Now, tea is a terminology, it's a term, right? Now, if we don't have the term tea, then we'll have to say, oh, boil the water,
Yeah.
add some tea leaves to it, right? And then strain it, and then add some sugar to it, optionally a milk to it, and then whatever happens, right, bring that thing to me, right? And then it's going to be a complete chaos if we don't have the right terminology. So now we have coined a term tea for that. We have coffee, and then we have different beverages have different food dishes have names, right? So when you ask for chicken tikka masala, what does that mean, right? So everybody it's a common vocabulary. So similarly in technical terminology, when you use those phrases, so when you say that hey, we have microservices, right? Instead of saying, oh, we have a lot of Spring Boot instances running different modules, right? It becomes too verbose, and people don't understand what we are talking about. But when you use a particular term that matches that particular pattern, it becomes extremely clear to everybody exactly what we are talking about. So it's a common knowledge, leveraging the common knowledge that exists in the community. It also avoids confusion and misunderstanding when we specify the right terminology. So the example that we were talking about, if someone says that I have a good DR setup, right, a good disaster recovery setup, it doesn't tell the full story, because what is good, right? It's very relative. Something which is good to a person might be bad to another person. So when we use the terminology like RTO or IPO, right, it becomes quantified, it becomes super concrete. There is no room for confusion. You're making a promise that if the site goes down, we'll bring it back in 4 hours. That's my RTO, right? So that it brings clarity to the situation, avoids misunderstandings. Now, the principles and patterns, that's a very important point. It's not just knowing the terminology. I would say that terminology is just a door there. That the door opens to a room, right? So those principles and patterns actually help us quickly solve problems in the right way and make us aware of the trade-offs. So if you know all the software principles, there is a possibility that sometimes you breach certain principles because there is a trade-off. For example, I have had interesting conversations with my colleagues that sometimes if you want to build an API which is very, very purely RESTful, it might result in a slightly suboptimal performance. So, if you want to choose performance, right, you might want to compromise the purity of your RESTful approach a bit. I mean, I don't have the example off top of my head, but I've had, a few of those situations. So the design principles help you make that trade-off because, sometimes you can't achieve both. So you can figure out exactly which one you require. I think I just covered that next point. It's a pointer to expand knowledge. So this is a very interesting concept. There are certain things we know. For example, let's say we know Java, we know Python, right? These are some of the basic things we know. Now, there are two other categories. They are known unknowns. For example, one of the known unknowns for me could be, let's say, Azure, because I have not used Azure and I'm not familiar with much of what happens inside Azure. I'm more familiar with, let's say, AWS, right? Or maybe my company is working in, I'm just taking an example. Let's say my company is working out of a private data center, right? I'm not using any of the public cloud in that case. So in that case, I may not know AWS or Azure or GCP, but I at least know that I don't know them. So those are the known unknowns. So for me, then AWS or Azure or GCP becomes a known unknown. And then there are unknown unknowns. So when we zoomed in on one of the previous slides, right, when I talked about DevOps, there were 100 things over there, right? And then a few years ago, for example, I didn't know what was blue green, right? Or I was chatting with Ardam the other day when I joined LinkedIn, right? I didn't know what canary was because I had worked in a very different environment before that, and there was no place for any birds or animals there. So I didn't know what was canary, right? And this is like another funny thing. So now that we are on this topic of canary, right? I'm sure most of you know, but canary is a yellow colored bird. I don't know if it also comes in other colors, but it's a bird. And in the coal mines, people used to carry the canaries because if there is a poisonous gas in the mine, the canary becomes sick and it might die. So the thing is, if you are doing a bad deploy, you first deploy to one box, which is the canary box. And if there is something harmful there, right, that one box will die, or you will see the matrix, you'll see exceptions, you will see 4xx 5x's happen in there, right? And something is wrong, and then you can save every other deployment from having that problem. So once you have this context, right, it becomes very easy to understand exactly why we are doing this. So it also connects to that other principle. But basically, when I go to so one of the questions that Ardam asked was, how do we sort of bridge the gaps, right? So a very important question, and I had this question for a lot of time, was what do you do with the unknown unknowns? And then I found two answers to that. They may not be perfect, but they work for me to some extent. Is that once I have a known unknown, for example, AWS in this case, right? Either get a book or read a Wikipedia article or take a training on that subject. Even if you just open a book and look at a table of contents, right, you will see a list of everything that now becomes your unknown unknown, and you convert that into a known unknown. Because until then, you didn't even know that things like S3 and EC2 and EKS existed. But once you start reading more about AWS, now those unknown unknowns became known unknowns. And then you can prioritize that, sure, AWS has 100 things, right? I don't need to know all of them at once, but I just know that they exist. So someday, if required, I can go and read that. For example, if someone says that, hey, I'm working on AWS, I need to find a authentication service, right? Then I just need to know that AWS has something called Cognito, which could solve the problem. I'm not saying that it will, but it could. So as long as I know that, right, then I can go and find out more about that. I can look up, okay, what are the alternatives to Cognito? What are the pros and cons? So this is an extremely important point as, we start growing in the career that, we know our knowns, known unknowns, and try to convert as many unknown unknowns into the known unknowns. The last point is establishing credibility. So it's very required for, I would say, two things: career growth and interviews. So I'll cover the interview part first. When you interview at a company, you have gotten 40 minutes to impress the interviewer, right? And in that discussion, if you use the right terminology, right, you establish your credibility. uh, for career growth, the same. When you work with your peers, your managers, and so on, right? As Adam was saying, right? Some people might judge you, and some people may not, right? Some people are kind, and they will just provide a very friendly feedback, saying that, okay, this particular term means this thing, right? Or go read on this. So, for example, uh, many years ago when I was at LinkedIn, right? In many meetings, I kept hearing there's a discussion, and then people are saying, "Who has got a D? Who has got a D?" And I had no clue what they were talking about, right? What is D, right? So uh, I was a bit scared to ask for the same reason that, will people judge me, that, oh, who is this idiot, right? Doesn't know what a D is, right? So other than it's a fourth letter of the English alphabet, right? I didn't know what D was. So I asked one of my kind friends, and he said, okay, there is a decision making model called Rapid. And the D is a decision maker in that Rapid. So it has 5 roles, like recommender, then agree, perform, input, and decision. So out of that, the decision maker is the D. And they were talking about who has got the D, as in who has the decision maker. Another funny example was, uh, a couple of meetings I heard that, how many bis we have, right? How many bis we have? I have no idea. So that was written as BIS, which apparently means butts in seat. And I really hated that term, but I was familiar with the term head count. So this was when I was a manager, and then I had no idea what are these guys talking about, right? Uh, when it comes to career growth, now I have a story to share with you, very similar to the story that Arnab was sharing. In one of the discussions with one of my senior directors in the companies I worked at, we were discussing a team situation, a team dynamic related situation, a people problem on the team. And my boss said, the Nikhil, I think you just need to, handle this with situational leadership. And then I'm a fairly honest person. I won't claim I'm a saint, but I'm a fairly honest person. So he could read on my face that I didn't know that word. So, and he was an extremely judgmental person. So he paused and said, Nikhil, do you know what is situational leadership? I said, no, I don't know. I could read on his face that, what the fuck are you doing as a manager then? You don't even know situational leadership? Go home, right? I came home and I read situational leadership, and then I realized that I have been practicing it all my life. I just didn't know that it was called situational leadership. So it's like, ever since we are born, we breathe air and we consume oxygen, and we give out carbon dioxide. We may not know those terms until we turn 6, 7, 8, 9, right? Whenever they teach that in school, that doesn't mean you cannot breathe, but you can't always choose your peers. You can't always choose your bosses, right? So it's important to be on the right side, and to master your terminology and establish the credibility. So cool. We'll go to the next slide. I think this is pretty much the last one, I would say. I think maybe I have one more. So when we master the terminology, right, I keep saying that, you have to really understand what it means. So these are some commonly misunderstood concepts, and I'll just pick one example here. So I'll talk about encrypt versus hash. I have seen so many people confuse these two terms. They are both coming from the cryptography, the security side of things. But uh, when you have something like a password, you can hash it. So you can validate it later, but you cannot reproduce the original password. It's a one-way function. You take a string, you take a SHA-2, right? The original stuff is destroyed. Whereas when you encrypt, right, you have a plain text, you create a ciphertext by encrypting, but then you can bring it back by decrypting. And this is extremely important because what information you are storing, for example, if you have a WhatsApp message, right, you cannot hash it, because then nobody can read it at that point. So you have to encrypt it so that the other person can read it. But when you are storing something like password, where nobody needs to know your plain text password except you can just hash it, salt it, and whatever. Another good example is, let's say, this is my favorite, so I'll talk about that. The Agile, Scrum, and Kanban. A lot of people think that writing stories and doing a daily stand-up means being agile, and that's unfortunately like one of the less important parts in my opinion. So I always feel that when you think about agile, the first thing that everybody has to do or should do is read the Agile Manifesto, because that's the philosophy that everything else is based on. So Scrum is an implementation or a manifestation of that. Kanban might be a manifestation. But what is important is the principle, why it was born. So unless we know what is waterfall and what was a problem with waterfall and why people wanted to, come up with something as agile, right? Then the ritual becomes more important. And what is the really important part? For example, delivering in small iterations, demonstrating what you have built, right? Getting a customer buy-in at periodic checkpoints, right? And making sure you're on the right track. All of that gets lost, and then people just start debating about whether you should have Fibonacci numbers or the days for story points and stuff like that. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. I think we have just 9 minutes. Yeah, I think I'll skip this. This was just a joke. You can read this later. I would just I think this is the important part. So how to master the technical terminology. We talked about a few of the techniques, but I would strongly recommend that try to listen to some tech talks. There is a conference called QCon that I have attended a few times in the past. And I believe even if you cannot attend it for whatever reasons, like either your company doesn't sponsor it or you don't have time to attend it particular year, they make some of their content public later on. You'll also find tons of tech talks on YouTube, right? So it's good to listen to some of the tech talks, because they usually have a good terminology and the concepts as well. Same articles, tutorials. I think the Beldung was the one that Artem you suggested to me, and I have been in love with that for since then. The guys who run the tech talks on QCon conference also have a newsletter called InfoQ. So that's a good article. You can pick and choose exactly what tracks you're interested in, and then your newsletter will be tailored to that. And again, we have books, and then I have purposely put dictionary because of the problems like the promiscuous mode and flash and fatal and things where we may not really understand the meaning of the words. Always look up the words in a dictionary. It will give really good information on roots of the words and origins and so on. Next extremely important point is look for examples. So don't just read a principle. For example, when I read a principle, something like interface segregation, I try to look up how it has been implemented in, let's say, Java standard library, because Java standard library has really good examples of a lot of patterns. And when I look at the example, it becomes more concrete in my mind. Maybe that's how I learn, but I find that once you find good examples, right, your understanding improves, and then you can really figure out what does it mean and what does it not mean. Because I have seen people misunderstand principles. For example, on one occasion, a colleague of mine told me, we're trying to solve two problems with one clever hack. And this colleague of mine told me that that's against the single responsibility principle, because he, for some reason, felt that, with single responsibility principle, you should just have one hack to solve one problem. And that's absolutely not what that means. So looking for examples is a good help, and build your own resources. So internet has a lot of information, but whenever you are trying to solve a particular problem, you can make your own notes that are tailor made for your own requirements, and then that will become a very good resource for you. So invest into that. You can try mind maps if you have not done already, because it's a very unstructured way of, I would say semi-structured way of storing information, but it gives you a lot of freedom. And the last thing to remember, Rome wasn't built in a day. This was initially intimidating for me when I felt that terminology or accuracy of precision of that communication, right? And Ardam mentioned that we both were hired by Pramod in one of our companies, right? Sorry about that. He was my mentor at LinkedIn, and he emphasized the importance of precision, conciseness in communication, clarity on my mind. And initially, I felt a bit intimidated that hey, I'm so behind, right? And I don't know anything. I'm so dumb, right? And then at some point, I realized that it's a process, right? It's a gradual change. It happens every day, and over the period of year, 2 years, 3 years, as you get into a habit, right? You will see the changes. You will see the needle moving, so to say. So don't expect things to change overnight, but keep your eyes open, and the change will happen over a period of time to lead you to a more satisfying career.
Nikhil, one practical advice that I do for myself. I remember the first time I heard Redis, for example. I just, after understanding what it does, what kind of a product is this, like how you can configure and administrate that. And then I just map it to the real concept behind it, like not the brand, but the concept. For example, in memory, the database.
Right.
And you search the industry for the other in-memory databases like
Right.
Memcache or Hazelcast. Not totally same thing, but like similar family.
Yeah.
So you can just like expand your knowledge that way as well. Like look at the brand or just like product in the industry, then find the concept, what it is realizing, and look for the other concepts relevant to that concept actually, because concepts are permanent. These products are temporary mostly. This is more important.
I think that's a wonderful and amazing point, Arnam, and that's tied to many of those points about being aware, the known knowns, known unknowns, right? So I had this similar experience when I moved from LinkedIn to eHealth. LinkedIn had its own data center, so we were in the private cloud. And then when I started, when I started working at eHealth, right, we were having plans to move into AWS, and I had this mental block that I have never worked in a public cloud, right? So I always found this sort of intimidating feeling that, oh, I have never worked in public cloud. And then in one of the discussions with my friends, it turned out that whatever tools and technologies exist on AWS platform, we pretty much have had each of them either homegrown or open source built at LinkedIn, because back then they didn't exist. So, pretty much everybody who worked in their own data center, like, let's say Yahoo or Google, Facebook, they all try to, solve that problem in their own ways. So it's important to know what category of tools you're talking about. For example, the Prometheus and Grafana, right? If you know Prometheus and Grafana, the next connection you should do is that they are observability tools. So they are monitoring metrics. And then from there, you can do other connections. So for example, who else exists in that space, right? For example, if you're working on AWS, right, the CloudWatch can offer you exactly the same capabilities. So once you know that, right, then in a discussion, you hear one more new technology, you won't feel lost because you know exactly what category or what family it belongs to. And if you understood the family right, you're just fine.
Gartner Magic Quadrants are really like helpful to understand which vendors are in that family, kind of like, and understand the high level families as well.
Adam, I'm going to edit my slides, after this, and then I'm going to put the Gartner quadrants. I mean, I'm so happy, you brought this point out because it's extremely important, because that's exactly the thing I should have said. But yeah.
Thank you. You told many things already. One of our audience, Bülent, just sent me a direct message. He's also saying like YouTube videos could also be helpful to understand the terminology.
Yes, absolutely. I have found so many amazing videos on YouTube, and there are some channels, right, dedicated channels to specific topics. So, you can just follow them, and anything new happens, right? You'll be.
I think this QCon has a channel on YouTube that you can watch videos, tech talks, as far as I remember.
Right. And yeah, this was one of the last points: trust but verify. Whenever you hear a particular term being used in a discussion, if you suspect something, just get a clarification, because everybody can misunderstand concepts, right? So when you hear the jargon, sometimes it's important to make sure that the person who is using the term actually means it, and it's not a incorrect use of the terminology that will lead to another problem. So yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Nikhil, we had almost 50 people. It is one of the kind of probably records that we had, the highest record that we had in a session.
Now I have 50 people who hate me, man. I'm kidding. No, it was really my privilege that I'm happy that uh, and this is something that I wish that 15 years ago, if I knew, right, then I would have shaped my career slightly better. So the sooner we know how to get better is better.
Mujahid?
Cool.
Have you thought about like I'm sure you have some notes on all over the place, probably all the vocabulary like you collected over the years, and have you thought about publishing them in like maybe in a GitHub page or something like that? Or maybe do you have it already? I don't know.
So I would say that yes and no, both. So for some time, I wasn't very organized about this effort. So I started improving in the vocabulary, but in my mind, I didn't keep notes of that. And then slowly that becomes a habit, right? So it like becomes part of who you are, right? It becomes like password, something now I have started doing a conscious effort of making notes so that I can pass it on. And I was just chatting with Ardam earlier that maybe if we have a small set of people work together on this, right, we can perhaps form a compilation of that and then give more structure to that. So unfortunately right now I don't, like some of the things that you see on the slide, right, it's pretty much that, and then some more in my head. But whatever is in my head, what is in Ardam's head, and your head, Ismail's head, right? We have to sort of get it all down together, and then that will become a good resource.
If one day you decide to publish, make sure you have the promiscuous mode.
Yeah. By the way, since we were doing the back in Turkey, I was in cybersecurity, Nikhil. So we were doing penetration testing or network testing as well. This promiscuous mode was used a lot, and we were using that term in Turkish.
Yeah.
In our meetings, like I'm here for promiscuous, like I'm just listening in promiscuous mode.
Right.
Since no one knows what that word means, that was fine. Like everyone understand the same, like what I mean actually. But in the US it didn't work that way.
That is true.
I should admit this is the first time I looked it up, and I didn't know that was its meaning.
It is very bad, Jai. It's not like little bad. It is very bad actually.
Perhaps we should have one more web page dedicated to that. The things that look harmless but are not. So there are a bunch of other things in that category. So yeah.
Thank you, Nikhil. I definitely want you to join for another session to talk about your other experiences.
Sure.
Maybe like about engineering culture. I know you are also. I learned many things actually, like how to be kind but at the same time direct.
Right.
Like maybe we can talk someday about that as well. Thanks for joining today and dedicating your time during this weekday.
It was my privilege and pleasure. So thanks for giving me this opportunity, Adam, and always glad to connect to this community and society, IT society. Yeah.
Thank you. See you all.
Great evening, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.